Lord, you're holy, holy, holy. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. I want to see you. I want to see you.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to
To
you,
you, Lord Christ. Zebedee's sons, James and John, approached Jesus. Teacher, they said, we want you to grant our request. What is it? He asked. They replied, see to it that we sit one at your right and the other at your left when you come into your glory. Jesus told them, you do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I shall drink, or be baptized in the same bath of pain as I? We can, they told him. Jesus said in response, from the cup I drink of, you shall drink. The bath that I am immersed in, you shall share. But sitting at my right or my left is not mine to give. This is for those for whom it has been reserved. The other 10, on hearing this, became indignant at James and John. Jesus called them together and said to them, you know how among the Gentiles those who seem to exercise authority lord it over them. Their great ones make their importance felt. It cannot be like that with you. Anyone among you who aspires to greatness must serve the rest. Whoever wants to rank first among you must serve the needs of all. The Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, to give his life in ransom for the many. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of our risen Lord. Amen. So, where's my sheet? Isaiah is writing about Jesus. Well, not really. You see, Isaiah was writing about the person who would come along and deliver Israel from captivity, from exile. Isaiah was writing about a guy who turned out to be Cyrus, the king of Persia, who finally said of the Israelites, okay, let's let them go back to Israel. And so he delivered them from their captivity. Early Christian writers, of course, look back on that and saw in this description something that they also saw in the experience of Jesus. And in fact, many, or at least two gospel writers, not many gospel writers, there's only 4 for crying out loud, but 2 of the gospel writers borrowed some of these words to describe Jesus' experience on the cross. And that's okay, as long as we're willing to pay the respect due to our Jewish ancestors and pay the respect to that heritage and not nullify the history of their experience that's here by saying, oh, that was about Jesus. It's not surprising that in the letter to the Hebrews, which was written, oddly enough, to Hebrews, that some of that language and that imagery is picked up. Letter to the Hebrews is probably one of the hardest ones for us to wrap our minds about, because it assumes that we're Jewish, and we're not. And so some of the imagery that was important to whoever wrote Hebrews, we don't really know, doesn't make so much sense for us. The notion of a high priest. Well, there was a high priest at the time of Jesus, but in Judaism now there isn't. And so a lot of that is lost on us. And sometimes there is an emphasis on suffering that seems really negative. But I'd like to talk about that a little bit in terms of this gospel and what the scriptures mean when they talk about suffering. And to do that, we have to talk a little bit about one way to view the scriptures. We can say that the whole of the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and the Christian scriptures, what we call the New Testament, are all looking at God exactly the same way. And there's a lot of people that believe that. But of course they're wrong. Because if you try and do that, it creates a whole lot of conflict. If you try and do that, then you're really sort of bound to keep the laws of the Old Testament, despite the fact that Jesus said he had come to fulfill them. When you drive by churches, for me anyway, it's always interesting to look at the sign out front and see what, for the ones that do this, what the scripture passage is for the week, what they're going to preach on. And it's interesting that those churches that emphasize power and control and behavior control of their members, very often the homily is based on an Old Testament passage. What I'd like to suggest instead is that over the, depending on what you believe, 6,000 years that Scripture evolved, 1,500 years that it evolved, either way, certainly a significant amount of time, people, of course, had a changing and evolving view of God. When they're captive in Israel, or in Egypt rather, all they care about is getting out of slavery and getting out. And then they get out there in the desert and they say, this is pretty harsh, we wish we were back in Egypt. And then when they finally get to the promised land, this is pretty good. And they see God as the one who sort of moved them through the desert like a chess piece, causing them to wander around for 40 years, and then finally get to where they were destined. And then they saw God as the one who wanted them to kill all the people that were in the land of Canaan, so that they could occupy the land. And they did that. And then Jesus comes along, skipping ahead several hundred years, and says that he's bringing a message of peace. So obviously these both can't be right. And that's okay, because people, as they grow and learn, have a different view of God. And so it's easy to get trapped up in this Isaiah passage, which seems to talk about suffering like something we should pursue. Give me some suffering. And because they saw suffering as being redemptive, and we saw that in Catholic Christianity through the Middle Ages. If you've seen or read the Da Vinci Code, you read about the practice of strapping a spiked leather strap onto your thigh with the spikes going in and tightening it to try and beat down your flesh, and that suffering would lead you to heaven. I don't think it's too healthy today to try and approach suffering that way. But this passage, these passages today rather make us try and come to some resolution of it. So the gospel, James and John are looking for status. We want to be number one and number two. And Jesus says, can you go through the experience I'm going to go through? And they say, yes. And he says, you're right, you're going to go through it, but it's not mine to grant you the first and second share, as it were. Those have already been reserved. And to this day, we don't know for whom. And it doesn't really matter so much. Have you ever wanted something really badly? Maybe it was in your teenage years, that new album that came out, or that pair of shoes that everybody had to have, or that boy or that girl to go out on a date, or that job, or just something that you really, really wanted. And you became so attached to what it was that it seemed like your whole world revolved around whether you got that thing or not. I've certainly been there. I'm not claiming to be exempt from this at all.